So it's easy to criticize that. So I'm kind of, taking advantage of something. And as Oscar Wilde once said of critics, that they are the people who come to the battlefield after the war is over and shoot the wounded. So I'm shooting the wounded for a moment because, again, I was fascinated, especially by the tour of Boston, having lived on Beacon Hill for so many years, knowing Charles Street Jail, which is the jail that is now the Liberty Hotel. It's really wonderful to watch the Liberty, just parenthetically for a moment, to watch the Liberty Hotel. Go there on a Thursday night. You don't want to be there. It's like really weird. But, again, I digress. But it's really wonderful to be able to watch, this historical event, this murder at Harvard and on Beacon Hill, and I'm waiting. I have a BlackBerry, but in about 2 months I'm going to be getting an iPhone when my service contract or the indentured servitude that I have to T-Mobile finishes. I'm going to get an iPhone only because these kind of applications are so exciting to me. I sound like, I'm poo-pooing all of that. I'm not. I think it's really exciting. My problem is, in terms of globalizing the world, if it becomes so easy to just use this little thing that's in your pocket, instead of, going to Venice, or going to Beacon Hill, or going, I don't care, to El Paso, Texas, if it becomes easier for us to do that, I think we are going to eventually, certainly not in the next 5 years or 10 years, but eventually, we're just going to say, I'll stay home, I'll turn on the television, let's see, I think I'll watch the Metropolitan Opera. Click. And you'll get a live feed from New York. How many people will never see Lincoln Center, this beautiful monument to art and performing art? Because they'll be able to sit in their house, click. Same thing with Broadway, same thing with great concert halls, same thing with Venice. That scares me a little bit. So how does theater solve this? Well, first of all, when you talk about globalization of theater, there really is none, because all theater is local. It's kind of like what Tip O'Neill said about politics. It's all local. Why? Because we want to see ourselves on stage. That's what we want to see. That's one of the reasons why I think, to pick up on something you said, Eric, that there is a tendency now to remake foreign films into American settings. Why? Because we don't want to watch French people. We don't want to do that. We want to see ourselves. And I think the theatrical experience does that better, frankly. Well, maybe not better, but certainly on a more timely basis than film. I'll use this example. The play As Is was written in the late 70s, early 80s, and was first performed in New York in 1981. It is considered the first theatrical play about the AIDS epidemic. Okay? The first film? That's the first major film. Prior to that, there were a couple of small independent things in 1987. The first major theatrical release about the AIDS epidemic was Philadelphia. Early 90s. We had already had 10 years, right? 9/11. Less than 2 months after 9/11, 3 plays played in New York about that disaster. The Guys is one about the New York Fire Department. One is The Mercy Seat by Neil LaBute, which the Lyric Stage produced a year later. And the third one escapes me at the moment, but it had Sigourney Weaver in it, that I remember. First movie about 9/11? I can't think of one other than the one about the airplane.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? That no one wanted to see because it was too harrowing. I can't remember it. So theater tends to react to things quicker. Why? Because it's storytelling. And in terms of those kinds of stories, talks about these global issues, not just in a documentary form, but tries to find a story to tell. Now, The Guys was more documentary. But The Mercy Seat, and I'll talk about that for 1 second, was a story about a man and a woman who were having an affair. They worked together, and they were at home sleeping together. They weren't home. They were at her house sleeping together when the man was supposed to be in the World Trade Center. All of a sudden, he has a new lease on life. Maybe I don't have to go home. Maybe I can start a new life. What a great story to tell. Now, we talk about that in this story form, and yet it lets us think, what kind of person would have that kind of thought? And one of the things that happens is his cell phone keeps ringing. It's his wife trying to find him. And he knows it. He doesn't answer it. And the play ends with his cell phone ringing, and he's standing in the middle of the stage. And of course, the woman who he was having an affair with, who was his boss, leaves. Says she's not going to restart her life for this. So now we talked about this great, huge, amazingly tragic disaster, but we boil it down to these two people who are not great people. You know, we talk about the heroes of the New York Fire Department, etc., but we don't talk about the bad people. And sometimes you have to talk about the bad people to understand the good people. So theater tends to, and I hate talking in generalizations, but I'm doing that right now, but tends to react to things sooner. You know, whether it's the events that I've talked about, whether there's a company, cannot remember the name of the company, but that is touring right now, telling stories about New Orleans. You know, during Katrina and post-Katrina. You know, we just did a production of a play, talk about globalization for a moment, which came from South Africa. It's a South African play called Groundswell. And it talks about South Africa post-apartheid, you know, and how things haven't changed much. Or if you look at it, people have the same sort of, you know, those same sort of racial feelings that are a little bit like us. A little bit. Which is why I wanted to produce it. So again, plays do come from outside of the country. But because all theater is local, what some playwright may be writing about in Nigeria, just to remember a place, may not affect what I'm thinking here in Boston. May not. It doesn't mean it won't, but may not. Because if all theater is local, then that playwright is talking about his experience. So, kind of summing up all of this, you know, I was going to say nonsense, but I won't say that. But summing up all of this for a second in terms of trying to look at the topic of globalization of theater, I'm hoping it doesn't become globalized. Or at least globalized to the point where you're going to sit at home and look at plays on television. I'm hoping that that experience, that reciprocal response experience that I talked about just briefly, will push you into a theater so you're sitting next to somebody laughing, or being moved, or crying, or having the hell scared out of you. Because theater can do all of those things. Let me just make sure I said everything I wanted to say that I wrote down on this really lovely notepad, which happens to be, and pick up a not so ripped copy of this outside. It's about a couple of productions that we're doing. Yes, I'm sorry, it's the shameless self-promotion. Connectivity, aspect of the story, super responsible, yes, see themselves on stage. You know, the other thing that I'm loving now is 3D television. Wow. 3D. I don't have to go. I can sit there and, you know, touch somebody. Oh, wait. No, I can't. How many, I always ask this question because how many of you have ever been to the lyric stage other than you, Barry, because you've been there forever? Oh my God, so many. Goodbye. No, first of all, thank you. Second of all, it's like being in your living room anyway, right? I mean, there's no seat that's further than 35 feet from the stage. You can touch people. We did a production of Edward Albee's The Goat. I'm not going to tell you what the plot is, but needless to say, the goat is part of the plot. But the house that happens gets totally destroyed. This woman goes literally crazy and starts throwing things around, breaking stuff. During rehearsals, I sat there and said, what happens if we smash something and something goes into somebody's leg? So we have what I call shrapnel rehearsals. What happens if we break something here and it goes there? Because again, it's live. We have to realize that if somebody breaks something in front of you and the front row of the audience is here, literally, they're going to jump out of their seats. And I want to make sure that, you know, I'm not working for them for the rest of my life. In the way of, you know, giving my paycheck to them. You know, I want to work for you the rest of my life, trust me. But, so the idea of that intimacy, too many people think of theater. 1,200 seats. I need field glasses to see the person on stage. That's not theater that I consider theater, or the type of theater that I want to do, or have been doing. It's more personal. And in terms of, you know, and I hope that this is not true, but I think it may very well be. As we get more globalized, as everything we do becomes more away from the small sort of community aspect of what we do, I think we start to lose something. You know, we may gain a great deal. We may gain, you know, people sitting at home and looking at their iPhones and touring Venice. And I think that's great because maybe there are people who will never be able to go to Venice and can experience it somehow. But I hope that people will go to Venice and experience it. I hope people will go to theater to experience that live experience, the live performance. And to hear somebody's cell phone go off, which is what that sounded like, but maybe it wasn't. I have nothing else to say, really. I think I've said more than enough. So thank you very much for listening.
Spiro, I have been trying hard to think as a member of your board, kind of a tagline for Lyric Stage, and I think you just gave it.
What's that?
Lyric Stage, it's in real 3D.
It's in real 3D.
You know, this was not what I expected out of this. And often in this class, things come up that I just could not have foreseen, and this was a wonderful interchange in terms of it. It does remind me of a wonderful conversation I had with Robert Putnam. Some of you may know Robert Putnam. He is a professor of political science at Harvard, and he wrote a very famous book about a decade or so ago called Bowling Alone. And what Putnam had shown in that book was that over time, people were spending less time together. And he was seeing this in one organization after another, the decline of religious organizations, the decline in the membership of the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, you name it. And the only place where he saw data that showed that there was an increase in people doing an activity was in bowling. Except he found out in the old days, 3 or 4 friends would get together and they'd go bowling. And now more and more people were bowling alone. I was out in Scottsdale, Arizona, invited by one of the big foundations, I think it was the MacArthur Foundation, and I was talking about some recent work that I was doing on the income distribution and wealth distribution, and Robert was the other person there, and I was fascinated by his talk because he started out and he told 2 stories that I think are apropos what we've gotten into tonight, and I'm hoping right after the break we'll get into it more. One, he said, he was at home. He lives in Lexington, not far from here, and he was sitting at home and he was working on his computer, and he was working on a paper that he was doing with several colleagues in different countries, and his father came into the room and looked over his screen and turns to Robert and said, are you really communicating with people in London and in Japan? Bob turned around to his dad and said, yeah, this is my work. This is the way I do it. And he clicks something, and something comes up on the screen. He introduces his father to several of these colleagues that he's won. And his father just shakes his head and says, this is just amazing. Next day, Bob comes back from work at Harvard, and his father comes over to him and says, son, that's really sad about Sybil. And his father said, Bob says, who's Sybil? And his father says, well, your next door neighbor, the person who lives on the other side of the fence. I was talking with her today, and her husband has been diagnosed with a terrible disease. And Bob says, no, I've never met Sybil. His father says, what do you mean? She lives next door. She's on the other side. And Bob's response is, Dad, we've only lived here 12 years. His other story, though, was equally apropos. He said, if you go back through the history of entertainment, he says, and you just have to go back, let's say, a couple hundred years here in the United States, the major entertainment on the frontier was the barn raising and the barn dance. And everybody came from town, and they all danced, particularly after they put up a barn, and they danced to the same music, and they danced with each other. And of course, if you've ever gone square dancing, everybody dances with everybody else at some time, do-si-do and so forth. He says, and that gives way by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, to vaudeville. Now we're still all together in a relatively small theater, possibly no bigger than this one, with live entertainment. And we're laughing together, we're thinking together, we're listening to the entertainment. And that gives way to the first films. And now we have a live audience, but we got, something on a screen. We lose that interaction. But at least we're still all together in the same theater. And then after World War II comes television. And now no longer do we have to go to the theater. We can stay at home with our family, presumably in front of our, as I remember, 13-inch or 12-inch round TV screen, Muntz TV, in a console about the size of a small Volkswagen, about 600 knobs on front of it. You remember that, for those of us a little older in the room, as you turn it on and come back about 20 minutes later because it had to warm up. You use it actually to heat the house during the winter. But the great news about it, we had the whole family together, we didn't have the whole neighborhood, but we could change from Channel 2 to Channel 4 to Channel 7. In Detroit, we'd even get CKLW, Channel 9 from Windsor in another country, across the river. But we were all there. And then we get the computer and the internet. And now everybody, as is true in my home, is that there will often be evenings when my wife and my 18-year-old son and I will all be on our laptop computers doing something differently in the same room, each one of us getting precisely the content we may want, but not interacting at all. The wonders of technology, but also the problems it causes. And if we think about the rest of the course, when we looked at the economy and the wonders we get of being able to supply ourselves with unfathomable goods and services at incredibly low prices because of globalization, cheap transportation, cheap communication that allows us to go to Walmart and get things at a fraction of a price we would have 20 years ago. And yet we lose something in it as well. And we see the same thing when we talked about international security, or the discussion that I was involved in last night at the American Jewish Committee over the whole question of Iranian loose nukes and the globalization of nuclear weapons, or now the globalization of theater, of film, of entertainment. So I think we have a lot to discuss. Let's take a 5-7-minute break, and let's come back and have our speakers come up here, and let's hash it out. Thank you.